Nandi Becki was 31 years old the first time she experienced real peace. Not the quiet kind that comes from being left alone, but the full kind that settles into your chest like warm soup on a cold night. She had grown up in a crowded house in Soweto, where silence was something you chased but never caught. But now, in a small rented house in El Dorado Park, sitting with her husband Longa, everything was different. It was a morning like any other. Nandi sat at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a mug of rooibos tea, watching the steam rise as if it were a small miracle. Their daughter Tando, only 4 at the time, was asleep on the couch, her shoes still on. Longa was humming something in the next room, without words, the way he did when he was happy and didn't need to explain why. These moments were small, but they held an entire life inside them. Longa would kiss her goodbye in the morning, saying, "Thank you, my love. It smells incredible. Daddy's got to go to work now, sunshine." Tando would smile even in her sleep. It was their daily routine, simple, full of love, and steeped in peace. Nandi knew this moment wouldn't last forever, but in that instant, she felt that her life had finally found the shape it was meant to have. That shape held for 5 years, Longa's love, Tando's laughter, and their small house that was their entire world. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, a truck driver fell asleep at the wheel on the N1 highway. Longa's car was no longer in the world, and Nandi had to learn what it meant to be a widow at 36, with a 9-year-old daughter who still wore her shoes to sleep, perhaps in the hope that one day she'd wake up and find her father had come home again. Nandi didn't spend too long in that grief, because even she didn't want to live inside it forever. She said once, years later, that grief is like the deep end of a swimming pool. If you keep swimming, you eventually reach the other side. But if you stop, you go under. She kept swimming, for Tando's sake, but also for her own. On nights when the house felt too big for just the two of them, on school mornings when Tando would watch other fathers picking up their children and her small face would do something complicated that Nandi couldn't put into words, even in all of that, Nandi never let herself believe there was nothing left for her in life. That pain was only one part of the story, a chapter that passed, but one that made Nandi stronger, a woman who would go on to survive every trial that came her way. Nandi went back to her job as a receptionist at a law firm. She stretched every rand until it was thin as paper. She learned to fix the geyser herself, to negotiate with the landlord, and to cook a week's worth of meals from a single chicken. Every Sunday morning she braided Tando's hair and told her stories about Longa, the good stories, the funny ones, so that the girl would know her father not as a ghost, but as a man who laughed too loudly at his own jokes and once got lost in Santon for 2 hours because he refused to ask for directions. Tando grew slowly and quietly, the way some flowers do, not all at once, but continuously. And Nandi, who had been surviving for years, began to feel, cautiously, like maybe she could live again. This period was difficult for them, but it carried a beautiful lesson within it, that a person can find a way through when they need to, and that a mother can learn anything for the sake of her daughter. Cibuso Lamini came into Nandi's life the way beautiful lies often do, gradually, softly, and with the appearance of being exactly what she needed. He was 40 years old, tall, well-spoken, with a job at a construction company and a car that was clean on the inside. He was introduced to Nandi through a mutual friend at a church fundraiser in Soweto. He didn't try too hard, and that was the thing that made her trust him at first. He was patient in a way that felt like respect rather than strategy. He brought small things, a bag of oranges because Tando had mentioned she liked them, a book about South African birds because Nandi had said only once that she used to watch them out the window when she was stressed. He remembered things. He showed up to things he wasn't obligated to attend. He helped Tando with her school project one Saturday afternoon and sat on the floor for 2 hours cutting out pictures of the solar system. And Tando laughed in a way she hadn't laughed in a long time. Nandi watched him carefully. She was not a careless woman. She had her mother's sharp eye and her own hard experience. She told herself she would not be fooled. She watched the way he treated waiters, the way he spoke to his mother on the phone, the way he reacted when things went wrong. And everything she saw told her that this was a decent man. When Cibuso asked Nandi to marry him, he did it simply. No grand performance, just the two of them at the kitchen table, the same table where she had once sat with warm rooibos tea and felt at peace. He said he wanted to spend his life making things better for her and for Tando. He said he understood what they had been through. He said he wasn't trying to replace anything or anyone, just that he wanted to be there. Nandi said yes. The wedding was small and warm. Tando, now 13, wore a yellow dress that she had chosen herself and stood beside Nandi like a young tree, straight, proud, already with the bearing of someone who had survived something and knew it. Everyone around her was happy. Her sister said he was a good one. The women at church said God had sent him. Her neighbor Masiolo, who had lived long enough to know bad men on sight, gave a nod of approval. But no one knew that this marriage would become the beginning of the greatest trial of these two women's lives, and also their greatest triumph. The change did not happen all at once. That is the important thing to understand. If it had happened all at once, if the man who had sat on the floor cutting out planets had turned overnight into a stranger, Nandi would have known. She was too sharp not to. But it happened the way a wound gets infected, quietly, beneath the surface, while everything above still looked alright. The first sign was small. A comment about the food being too salty, delivered not as an observation but as a verdict. The way he said it, not looking at her, not softening it, not even bothering to disguise the contempt underneath, was different from anything she had seen in him before. Nandi noticed, but said nothing. She was not a woman who made mountains from molehills. Then there was the night he came home late. She asked where he had been, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, cold and slightly amused, as if the question irritated him but he wasn't alarmed by it at all. "I don't report to you," he said. That was all. And he went to bed. By the 3rd month of marriage, Nandi knew. She knew the way women who have spent their whole lives paying attention know things in the body before the mind catches up. The man she had married was not entirely the man who had courted her. Or perhaps more accurately, the man who had courted her had been performing, and the performance was over now that he had what he wanted. What Cibuso wanted, it turned out, was control. He started with small rules. The television could only be on certain channels in the evenings. Money had to be accounted for, every grocery receipt presented, every expenditure explained. Friends could not visit without his prior approval. These things he framed at first as preferences, as the way a proper household runs. But they were not preferences, they were tests. And when Nandi did not comply, not out of defiance but simply because she had been a grown woman running her own life for a long time and found it difficult to justify buying tomatoes to another adult, the tests became punishments. The punishments were not physical, not at first. They were something harder to explain and harder to prove. He would go days without speaking to her. He would speak to her only to diminish her cooking, her clothes, her intelligence, her decisions. He called her ungrateful in front of Tando. He called Tando a burden, not directly, never directly, but in the constructed, plausible way of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. "This child eats like she pays rent," he said once, laughing as if it were a joke. Tando did not look up from her plate. Nandi, who had spent years being a woman of quiet dignity, felt herself being slowly hollowed out. What Cibuso never understood, and this was the flaw at the center of everything he did, was that he believed cruelty and control were the same thing. They are not. Control is what you have when someone chooses to obey you. Cruelty is what happens when someone stops being able to afford not to, and then eventually finds a way. In the Zulu tradition, there is a saying, a person is not discarded. It speaks to the belief that no matter how far someone falls, they still carry the capacity to rise, because they are human, and humanity is not a thing you can take from a person no matter how hard you try. Cibuso tried very hard. He did not understand that every time he pushed Nandi and Tando toward the edges of themselves, he was also pushing them toward resources they had never known they had. The household grew quieter, heavier, but underneath that quiet something else was beginning to stir, something neither woman had named yet, but both were starting to feel. The walls of the house, the same brick walls that had once held warmth and laughter, now seemed to hold their breath along with the family inside them, waiting to see what would happen next. It was the insomnia that started it in the end. Nandi had always been a good sleeper, the kind who was unconscious within minutes of her head touching the pillow. But in the second year of her marriage to Cibuso, she began waking at 3 in the morning. Not from nightmares, just waking the way the body does when the mind is carrying too much. She would lie there in the dark, Cibuso breathing heavily beside her in that particular deep-chested way she had once found comforting and now found oppressive. And she would think about Tando, about money, about how much longer this could go on, about whether she had made an irreversible mistake, about Lunga, who would have hated to see her like this. One night, instead of lying there, she got up. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table, her table, the one she'd had before him, the one she'd brought into the marriage the way you bring a piece of yourself. And she opened her laptop. She was not sure what she was looking for. She typed things into the search bar the way a person does when they are looking for an exit but are not yet sure what shape the door will be. That single quiet decision, made at 3 in the morning over a cup of tea, would turn out to be the first thread in a much larger unraveling, though Nandi herself did not know it yet. She found an online course in administration and business management, offered by a college that ran evening classes and distance learning. The fees were not small, but they were not impossible either. She thought about it for 3 weeks. She said nothing to Cibuso. She moved money slowly, the way water moves around a rock, not fighting it, just finding the route around. A little from the household budget here. A little from the money she had been setting aside since long before him, an account he didn't know about because she had never told him, and he had never thought to ask about a woman's private savings. She enrolled. She told no one except Tando. Tando, who was now 15 and had been watching her mother with the careful, steady gaze of a child who has grown up faster than she should have, looked at Nandi for a long moment when she was told. Then she nodded once. Good, she said. Just that. And she went back to her work. Tando, by this point, had built a wall that Cibuso could not entirely reach. It was not something she had planned. It was something she had created the way children under pressure often do, by going deep into the places where she was strongest. For Tando, that was school, not as a refuge exactly, but as territory, a place where no one could tell her she was worthless, where the numbers either added up or they didn't, and if she understood them, they obeyed. Tando's teachers noticed her. One teacher in particular, a woman named Mrs. McConnor, who taught mathematics and had the sharp intuition of someone who had been in classrooms long enough to read what children were carrying from home, pulled Tando aside one afternoon and told her that she had the kind of mind that should go to university. She said it plainly, not as encouragement, as information. Tando had it the same way. She went home that evening and applied quietly for a scholarship she had found on her own. She didn't tell her mother. She didn't want to raise a hope that might not happen. She simply sent the application and then continued studying the way she had been doing, steadily, without drama. For Tando, school had become more than just a place to learn. It was a territory entirely her own, somewhere Cibuso's words couldn't reach her, somewhere her worth wasn't decided by anyone's mood at the dinner table. Numbers obeyed her. Essays rewarded her effort. In that quiet, disciplined corner of her life, she was building something he could not touch and did not even know existed. Mrs. McConnell's words stayed with her, not as praise to be proud of, but as a fact to act on. And act on it she did, with the same steady, unflashy determination that had carried her through every difficult year in that house. The reply came 6 months later, on a Thursday. Tando was in the kitchen when she opened the email. Her mother was at the sink. Cibuso was in the living room. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Nandi and said very quietly, "Mama, I got it." Nandi turned around. "Full scholarship," Tando said. "University of Cape Town." The silence that followed was the kind that holds more than words can say. Nandi crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her daughter in both arms, and they stood there, not crying, not immediately, because they had both learned to be careful about showing emotion in that house. Just holding. From the living room, Cibuso's television played on. He found out at dinner. Nandi told him, partly because it was impossible to hide, and partly because some part of her wanted him to sit across from this news and understand what he had been living next to all this time. Cibuso put down his fork. He did not congratulate her. What he actually said, in that constructed way of his, was, "So she's going to Cape Town, and who exactly is going to pay for what the scholarship doesn't cover? Who pays for the clothes, the transport, the incidentals?" Tando looked at him. Nandi said calmly, "We'll manage." "You'll manage," he repeated, the way he said it meant to be humiliating, as if the idea of the two of them managing anything without him was absurd. "Yes," Nandi said. "We will." And she meant it in a way she had not yet been able to say out loud before. The next 12 months were the most difficult and the most clarifying of Nandi's adult life. Tando went to Cape Town. She carried very little, a suitcase, a backpack, the kind of self-sufficiency that only comes from years of learning not to depend on anything or anyone. She called her mother every evening in the first month, less frequently after that, not because she stopped caring, but because she was becoming someone who could manage the distance. Nandi completed her diploma. She sat in a classroom twice a week with people half her age and twice their energy. She was not always the smartest person in the room, but she was often the most determined. Her lecturers remembered her, not because she was loud, but because she never missed a session, and her assignments were always in on time, and there was a quality to the way she worked that felt less like studying and more like recovering something she had always owned. She passed with distinction in 2 of her modules. She said nothing to Cibuso about any of this. By now, she had stopped performing the marriage the way she used to. She cooked because the house needed to eat. She cleaned because she couldn't bear disorder. But she had stopped trying to manage his moods or soften his comments or explain herself to a man who had no interest in understanding her. She was still in the house, but she had stopped being inside the marriage in any real sense. The law firm where Nandi had worked as a receptionist for years noticed the change in her. When she submitted an internal application for an administrative coordinator position, a role 3 levels above her current one, her supervisor said yes before she had even finished explaining why she was qualified. "We've been wondering when you'd apply," the woman said, which told Nandi something important. The version of herself she had always been was visible to everyone except the man she lived with. The salary increase was not dramatic, but it was real. Combined with Tando's scholarship covering the bulk of her university costs, Nandi found, for the first time in years, a small margin of financial breathing room. She did not spend it carelessly. She did what women who have survived scarcity learn to do, she moved slowly and methodically. She opened an account he absolutely did not know about. She found a lawyer, one of the attorneys at the firm, a woman who worked in family law and had, without being asked, left her card on Nandi's desk one afternoon. Just that. No words. Just the card. Nandi put it in her purse and said nothing. She took it out 6 weeks later and made an appointment. The thing about Cibuso, and this must be understood, is that his cruelty was not born from strength. Strong men do not need to diminish the people they live with. His cruelty came from a terror he would never have admitted, that the women in his house were becoming more than he had anticipated, and he could feel it. He had no tools to handle it except the ones he had always used. So he escalated. The comments became louder. The control became tighter. He began monitoring Nandi's phone. He began speaking to her with a kind of contempt that was no longer even trying to disguise itself, not because he had given up performing, but because he believed the performance was no longer necessary. He thought she was trapped. He had done the math: no husband before him, a daughter in another city, a woman who had always depended on others. He had not done the math correctly. Beneath the surface he could see, Nandi was building a life with documentation, savings, a diploma, a promotion, and a lawyer's card folded carefully in her purse. Tando, in Cape Town, was becoming a young woman who answered to no one's cruelty anymore. Cibuso believed he held all the power in that house. He did not realize that the very women he was trying to crush had quietly built an exit, brick by brick, while he wasn't looking. It happened on a Sunday in June when Tando came home from university for the media break. She was 19 now. She had been in Cape Town for nearly a year and a half, and the university had done something to her that distance and hard work does to certain people. It had sharpened her. She walked into the house with a particular kind of self-possession, not arrogance, not aggression, just the unmistakable presence of someone who had been thinking for herself for a long time and had grown confident in her own conclusions. Nandi noticed it the moment Tando walked through the door, the way she set down her suitcase, the way she looked around the room as if measuring it against a life she now knew was possible elsewhere. There was warmth in her embrace, the same daughter who had always loved her mother fiercely, but there was also something new underneath it, a quiet certainty that had not been there before. Cibuso did not like it. He could feel the shift the moment he saw her, the way a man feels a draft before he sees the open window. The girl who used to look down at her plate when he spoke was now looking him directly in the eye, and there was nothing in her expression that asked his permission for anything. The house, usually heavy with unspoken tension, now held something sharper in the air, the sense that something long delayed was finally arriving. The tension began over something trivial, the way Tando greeted Cibuso, which he found insufficiently deferential. He made a comment. Tando replied, not rudely, but firmly. He escalated. She did not retreat. Something about her refusal to shrink, something about the fact that this young woman no longer responded to him the way a frightened teenager would, cracked the careful facade he had been maintaining and released the thing underneath. He said things that Nandi would not repeat later, even to the lawyer. He told Tando she was nothing, that her education meant nothing, that she was in his house and would obey him or leave. He said it with the full weight of someone who believed the words as he spoke them. Nandi stood up. What she said was very quiet. It was not a speech. It was just 3 sentences, the way truth often is when it doesn't need decoration. This is not your house, Cibuso. My name is on that list. And this conversation is done. He raised his hand. He did not strike her, but he raised it in a way that was meant to communicate that he could, that he had the capacity, and she should be aware of it, and that awareness should be enough to make her small. The problem was that Masiolo's daughter was in the kitchen. She had come over earlier to help Nandi with something and had stayed for tea, and she was standing just inside the kitchen doorway with her phone in her hand. She was the kind of young woman who had grown up in a generation that knew what to do when they witnessed something important. She recorded it. Not the whole argument. She hadn't expected the argument. But she got the moment, the raised hand, Nandi standing still and not flinching, Tando in the background, Josette. What followed moved faster than Nandi had expected, even with a lawyer already involved. The video was not the only evidence. When the case was opened, and it was opened because Nandi had the card and made the call, Masiolo's daughter's footage was shared with the police because she had been waiting her whole life for a chance to do something that mattered. It was a small, almost accidental act, a young woman simply standing in the right doorway at the right moment, phone already in her hand the way phones always are now. But that small act became the turning point that years of quiet documentation, careful notebooks, and patient preparation had been waiting for. Nandi had been keeping records quietly, methodically, the way her grandmother had taught her to keep receipts, because you never know what you need to prove to someone who doesn't believe you. She had dates, text messages, a log of incidents that she had written in a small notebook that lived at the bottom of her bag, which he had never searched because he had never thought her capable of such forethought. The attorney at the law firm had helped her understand what those records meant, had helped her understand what protection the law could offer and what it couldn't, and how to build a case that was airtight, not because it was dramatic, but because it was documented. The neighbors were asked if they had heard things. Several of them had. Several of them had been waiting. There is a thing that happens in communities where cruelty occurs behind closed doors. The people around it often know more than the person inflicting it realizes. They know because sound travels, because faces speak, because women talk to each other over fences and in church halls and at the school gates in a language that does not always use words. They had known about Cibuso for some time. Some of them had not spoken because they did not want trouble. Some had not spoken because they had not been asked formally by someone who could use what they said. When they were asked formally, they spoke. Cibuso was arrested on a Thursday morning. He came out of the house in his work clothes, heading to his car, and there were police at the gate and a process server beside them, and Nandi standing on the front step watching with an expression that was not triumphant. It was the expression of a woman who had been patient for a very long time. He looked at her. He seemed, in that moment, genuinely confused, as if the world was behaving illogically. He would feel that way for a long time. The trial took months, the way these things do. There were delays and procedures and the particular slowness of formal justice. But the evidence was what it was: the notebook, the video, the witnesses, the records, the testimony of a lawyer who could speak to what she had observed over several months of professional counsel. Cibuso had legal representation that tried, but you cannot effectively argue against documentation. You can dispute memory. You can challenge emotion. You cannot argue with dates. He was found guilty on multiple counts: domestic abuse, financial control, intimidation. The sentence was not the maximum, but it was real. He went to prison on a cold Wednesday in August, and the name Cibuso, which means blessing, sat in that courtroom like an accusation of its own. Cibuso, blessing. He had named himself a gift. He had behaved like a curse. Tando graduated from the University of Cape Town 2 years later with a degree in computer science. She did it without fanfare. She was not a person who needed fanfare. Nandi attended the ceremony wearing a dress the color of sunflowers, because she had worn enough dark colors for enough years, and she sat in the audience and watched her daughter walk across the stage and thought of Lunga, who would have been undone by pride. She did not cry. She had done her crying in smaller, more private moments over the years. What she felt sitting in that auditorium was something closer to gratitude, not the kind that bows down, but the kind that stands up, the kind that says, "We made it through." Tando got a job before she'd even finished her final semester, at a technology company in Johannesburg. The salary was more than Nandi had made in her best year at the law firm, and Tando was 21. The girl who had once cut paper planets on a living room floor with a man who pretended to care, who had once stared down at her plate while being called a burden, was now walking off a university stage into a future entirely of her own making. The auditorium lights, the cap thrown into the air, the proud faces of strangers cheering for their own children, none of it mattered as much as the quiet certainty settling in Nandi's chest. They had not just survived. They had built something real. Nandi left the receptionist desk for good the following year, not to retire, she was not yet that age, but to join a small business that a friend of hers was starting, a company that offered administrative services to small organizations. She brought her diploma, her years of experience, and a particular calmness that comes from having survived something that should have broken you. The business grew, not quickly. Nothing good grows quickly, but steadily. She moved out of the house in El Dorado Park finally. She had stayed longer than people thought she should, but she had her reasons. The lease was in her name. The memories of longer were in those walls. And she was not the kind of woman who runs. But eventually she found a different place, a flat in a complex in Soweto with a small garden and a kitchen with good light in the mornings, and she bought it with money she had saved and money she had earned and a bond she had applied for and received on the strength of her own income. There was something quietly powerful about that, a home bought entirely on the strength of her own name, her own work, her own decisions. No one else's signature was on those papers. No one else's permission had been required. The first morning she made tea in that kitchen, rooibos, the same as always, she sat at the table with both hands wrapped around the mug and felt the steam rise, and felt again, after many years, the particular peace she had once known in a small rented house when Tando was 4 and Longa was humming something in the next room. It was not the same peace. It was older. It had more in it. It had been earned the way certain things are earned, by refusing to stop when stopping would have been easier. She heard, through the kind of community news that travels without trying, that Cibuso was not doing well in prison. Not from illness, from himself, from the particular torment of a man who had spent his life believing he was the most important person in every room and was now in a room that disagreed with him completely. She did not feel satisfaction at this. What she felt was something quieter and more honest, the recognition that the life he had chosen had always been leading somewhere, and it had led there. She had not put him in prison. He had put himself there, step by step, over years of choices he made freely and would now spend a long time regretting. Nandi did not tell this story easily or often. She was not a woman who wore her wounds like credentials. But sometimes, on evenings when Tando came to visit and they sat in the kitchen together with tea and the kind of easy silence that only exists between people who have been through fire side by side, someone would ask, a friend of Tando's, perhaps, or a younger woman who sensed something in Nandi that she couldn't name but wanted to understand. And Nandi would tell it, not all of it, just enough. She would say there are people who look like blessings but arrive to take things from you. You may not recognize them at first. You may believe them for longer than you wish you had. That is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of their character, not yours. She would say the years that feel like they are killing you are sometimes the years that are making you. She would say, keep records, learn things, find your people, know your rights. She would say, a person is not discarded, not by hardship, not by cruelty, not by a man who confused control with love and power with worth. She would say Tando grew up watching her, and she hoped her daughter saw more of the strength than the struggle. But even the struggle, she hoped Tando knew, was never shame. It was just the cost of getting somewhere worth being. The last thing to say about Cibuso Lamini is almost too simple to be a lesson, but it is the truest one. He had been given a name that meant blessing. He had been placed next to two people who, had he been what he pretended to be, would have loved him fiercely and returned his kindness 100-fold. He had been handed a second family, rare in any life, and he had held it like it was nothing, because he did not understand what he was holding. And in the end, the blessing he could not give became the very thing he could not have. While he sat with nothing but time and regret, Nandi sat in a kitchen with good light. Tando worked in an office writing software that hundreds of people would use without knowing her name. And the two of them, mother and daughter, continued to build the life that no man's cruelty had been able to dismantle. Not because they were extraordinary. Because they refused to stop. The Zulu have a saying often used to make sense of moments like this: growth is feared by those who cannot grow themselves. It explains why jealous, destructive people try to prevent others from rising. They sense the growth, and they try to stop it, not understanding that what they are actually doing is sealing their own fate. Because what you try to destroy, if it is strong enough, returns to outlast you. Cibuso had tried to stop two women from growing. What he had done instead was fertilize them.